Okay, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show, Monday edition, Week 8 review. I'm Eric Eager. I'm one of the VPs at Sumer Sports. I'm joined by the CEO of Sumer Sports, Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, you had an eventful weekend. You got to go see some prospects play football. You got to hit some balls around the range a little bit and go for those negative numbers, which is exactly what I want to segue into. Because the Giants yesterday, Thomas, -9, great score. Tiger Woods in his prime, -9, feels like, we'd all be pretty happy with that.
That's incredible.
Passing yards yesterday, Tyrod Taylor gets hurt. Tommy DeVito, not Danny DeVito.
Not Danny DeVito, right?
Tommy DeVito. Although Danny had more passing yards than Tommy did yesterday. Goes in there. They have a lead in large part because the Jets simply can't move the football. Zach Wilson, the most untalked about thing that's going to happen today is in a league full of quarterbacks who have not met their potential. Zach Wilson is on the hook for none of this because they came back and won. He made a couple nice throws down the stretch in that game. But the Giants' worst passing output of this century, it's one where if you look at the SumerSports.com Twitter profile here, you are going to get a bunch of red because neither team could really move the football. They go down in overtime. Was it 13-10, Thomas? This game had kind of a little bit of everything. I'm going to show everybody, if you want to look at the Sumer Sports Twitter account. Things are a little slow on the browser today. Here, there we go. Here we go with a 13-10 victory by the Jets. The Jets are back to 500. Horrendous stuff. Honestly, the Jets, interestingly, were worse from an EPA per play perspective than the Giants. From a success rate standpoint, the Giants were successful on just 2 out of every 9 plays yesterday. Thomas, what went in your mind?
Well, -9, I know we can beat that up all day, and I know it was the third string quarterback and everything. I go right to watching Brian Daboll losing his mind on the side and knowing his personality. I mean, he's a really competitive guy. Think about this, though, right? You come in last year, you're the coach of the year. Everyone's lauding everything about it, right? Mr. Mara's behind you and Joe Shane as the head coach and a GM. And then you hit this, right? How does that feel? How do you deal with that? We've all had those ups and downs, right? That's the NFL. But when you start looking at this now, remember, and a friend of mine, and I know he took a ton of heat, Dave Gettleman took a lot of crap at that organization, right? I get it, the way people want to throw it around. Where do you go with that? When you start seeing all of that red and you see the turn of events this year, like where do you go? Where do you dig in? If I'm asking you as, the data guy, chief of staff guy, hey buddy, where are we with this Giants thing? What's causing it?
Well, it seems like they've already kind of gone to one solution. I do want to bring up something else Sumer related because this weekend I wrote an article on Sumer Sports. By the way, it'll ask you to subscribe if you go to the website. But I wrote an article about trades, and it's interesting, Thomas. I predicted that Leonard Williams would get traded today, or be traded, and not only that, but they traded him in a way very similar to when the Broncos traded Von Miller, which is. They got a pretty good set of draft capital in return. It was a second and a fifth. They're keeping all of the $10 million, all but the minimum salary. They're keeping that, and they're sending Leonard Williams over to Seattle today for those draft picks. To me, it feels a little bit, and I don't want to disparage anybody, but you're right about Daboll. Last year, he looked really good in the metrics. He wins Coach of the Year. Daniel Jones has his best season, right? Similar to Josh Allen, who had his best seasons with Daboll. And everything's looking up. They bring in Darren Waller. They bring in some, slottish receivers. A lot of good players on defense still. And frankly, Thomas, their defense doesn't suck. They held Buffalo to a pretty, reasonable margin and all this stuff. And I think, unfortunately, there has been a little bit like finger pointing on the sideline. I feel like when Tyrod Taylor, for example, checked into a run and they ran against Buffalo at the end of the half, I mean, he dressed his player down on the sideline for something that's really a coach and a player sort of situation. And so the thing I get worried about is I think Daboll has the goods from a gray matter perspective, I think he's more than qualified to coach this team. But when things go wrong, you see a different side of somebody. And so I get a little bit worried there because it feels like, okay, Leonard Williams, a high price guy. Are you throwing him under the bus by trading him to Seattle? Daniel Jones has already been somebody that I think publicly in games you can see that getting a decent amount of the blame, and so on. I think they need to take a step back and look at what expectations should have been this year, which is you were going to be worse. Your schedule is much harder. And so just take the good with the bad. But I know that from a football perspective, that's really hard to do.
Taking the good with the bad. Look, I used to have coaches, I've said this before, on the staff who would say, Thomas, you just need to calm down, wait for another 3 or 4 or 5 games before you can panic. And as a GM, that's really tough to do. And as a head coach, I mean, Brian Daboll is very competitive. I don't hold it against him that he's agitated. He needs to keep the fire on these guys, lit. I'm all about that. But I can only imagine when you think about the Maras and you think about what they're just such a classic football family and how they're watching how things are evolving. And they're like, we're on the other side of this last year. Yep. And now they're reverting to something that is complicated. Is that right? 2 and 6.
I believe it's 2 and 6. I think that they're hoping to get Daniel Jones back in week 10, but now with this injury to Tyrod Taylor, which appears to be quite serious, I think they're probably going to hope that Daniel Jones can come back a little bit sooner.
Well, and then my last thing is, where does Joe Shane enter in this? It's interesting. There's always a lot talked about with a head coach a year after that kind of a season where it was so up and now it's down. Where is Joe on this, and how does Joe operate? Normally, everyone, as a GM, when you're going through that, you're there behind the scenes with your head coach. You're encouraging them. You're updating that head coach when the time is right, when he's not thinking about this season. Eric, you're telling him what might be out there in free agency, what might be out there in trade time, what might be out there as the draft's coming around. That's how you keep a head coach calm. And then you say, now you focus on winning some more games.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you were saying my name because I was looking over at this computer and I was looking at, you guys dealt with the similar thing, right? 2009, you guys started out kind of hot, 4-1, but then in the middle of the season it was kind of a down. You guys were at 6-7, and then I think to your credit and really what kind of pushed you guys forward to 3 consecutive playoff appearances after that was you guys finished the year 3 straight wins to go 9-7. It wasn't going to be considered a success relative to your first year where you made the playoffs and were competing for a division title. And obviously the Saints won the Super Bowl that year, so even then you're even more overshadowed. But then you get into 2010 and you're the 1 seed. 2011 you're a playoff team again. 2012 you're the 1 seed again. And it does matter how you deal with these seasons because they happen, right? Like I want to transition a little bit into the Vikings here for a similar reason, right? Because the Vikings, much like the Giants, they were, they won a lot more games than maybe they should have last year. Like the Vikings had a negative point differential, but they won 13 games. They were beaten, interestingly, by the Giants in the playoffs. And then this year, they start out 1-4. Now, unlike the Giants, although I will give Daboll this, not to close the book on the Giants discussion. The Giants have been much more competitive the last few games, right? They went ahead and they took Buffalo down to the wire. They beat Washington, who, by the way, Washington has played Philly to the buzzer in both games. Like, they're not a terrible team. And then yesterday they should have won, even though they didn't. And that Jets team, aside from quarterback, is actually very good. So I do think the Giants have come back and been competitive. The Vikings go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, look, I want to be very direct about this. I want Daboll to kick some damn ass. Like I want to see that fire. Yeah. I can't imagine that's not what ownership wants. You show it when it's up. You're where you are, but when you're down, you better be clawing to get back in it. It has to matter.
Well, and it's tough when you're a coordinator.
Yeah.
They've all been, like, most coaches are coordinators before the head coaches, but there is a little bit of an interesting thing where, like, I think about Eric Bieniemy, right? And we're talking about Eric Bieniemy was always the guy that would you notice when you watch that quarterback documentary on Netflix, you don't see Eric Bieniemy hardly at all. And that was because Eric Bieniemy would walk into the room and talk shit to Patrick Mahomes about, he was the bad cop, right? He was the guy that would come in and keep Patrick, sort of on the straight and narrow. Mm-hmm. And not to say that he's not worthy of being a head coach, but that might be one of the reasons why no one has wanted him to be a head coach yet. I think about Daboll similarly, like when you have kind of a firm, stable, successful head coach like Sean McDermott, right, who's even keeled kind of in that Dungy way, and then you have the offensive coordinator who's kind of a prick, in that way. Not to, again, I'm making conjecture, but you have the offensive coordinator who behind the scenes is kicking the quarterback in the ass. When those things change, right, it's revealing in some ways, right? When you're good, when you're going good, and when you start 7-2 last year, you finish 9-7-1, you win a playoff game. No one necessarily sees what happens when things go poorly, and then that's part of maturing into a head coach is maybe not necessarily having that disposition all the time.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Anyway, so transitioning to the Vikings, like Kirk Cousins not playing well. They start 1-4. Their best player, probably one of the top 5 players in the whole league, hurts his hamstring. They win 3 straight games without him. They go to Lambeau Field, their biggest rival, the Packers. They go there, they beat them by multiple scores. They're up by 3 touchdowns. Kirk Cousins tears his Achilles. And in sort of this crazy way where this team under Kevin O'Connell, who, when you watch that quarterback, got much more positive, much more like kind of in that whole like, I kind of admire his ability to lead, right? Takes that team from 1-4, best player on injured reserve, gets to 4-4, including beating a very good Niners team on national television. And now they're stuck here 2 days before the trade deadline, very much in the playoff hunt in the NFC, but with a roster that would scream rebuild if they had maybe one more loss on their schedule. What the hell do you do in this situation if you're Kwesi Adofo-Mensah?
Well, first of all, and you might have alluded to it, I feel like I have more faith in this prior to this injury, of course, faith in this Minnesota team, comparatively speaking to last year. Remember, well, of course you do. We talked a lot about it, right? I just feel like there's a lot more in place here. And I feel like there's more consistency up to this point, compared to last year when they were making, their moves and winning by what they were winning and how they were winning. I'm more behind this team now. To your point, Kwesi's got to really step back and decide on how he wants to approach this. What is their backup situation? Just reiterate.
Yeah, so Nick Mullins is on injured reserve with a back injury. So he's been out for three games or so now. He's only been on IR for 2, but I think you can back play it. I'm actually not sure. Jaron Hall, the 5th round pick or 6th round pick out of BYU, a guy who a lot of people who I think are very smart in the NFL. I got message after message, and it's funny because Kwesi ended up drafting him. I got a lot of messages from people in the league who are like, "Hey, this Jaron Hall guy is pretty good. His metrics are pretty good. He's a little on the smaller side, if I remember correctly, but he's the guy that played yesterday for Cousins. He's the only backup quarterback on the roster. So they got Sean Mannion, their longtime backup, on the practice squad. So right now their quarterbacks are Jaron Hall at BYU, a rookie, and Sean Mannion, a veteran.
It's not in my nature at trade time to go out there, especially when you're driven by crazy need right now to try to find a quarterback who you're not even sure are going to fit into your mode. Look, any team that would ever get rid of trade their quarterback right now doesn't have a lot of belief in them anyway, right? I'm alluding to some of the quarterbacks that you're probably thinking about. Who you're knocking on the door. And as a GM, you're reaching out. You're like, is there anything? Are you looking to sell anyone? Do you have anyone who can zip the ball? Or it's beyond that, right? It's just you're going to be knocking on doors, a lot of doors, trying to figure out. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, Minnesota has some history here, right? They have, Brad Johnson broke his thumb in 1998. And Randall Cunningham took him to the conference championship game. In 2016, Teddy Bridgewater tore up his knee in practice, and they went out, spent a first rounder on Sam Bradford, who all things considered did pretty well for them. And then in 2017, Sam Bradford was playing incredibly well and hurt his knee, and they went out and Case Keenum was their backup, and Case Keenum took them to the conference championship game. I do believe, by the way, side note, if you would have beaten the Eagles, I think you would have kicked the Vikings' ass in the playoffs that following week. But that, notwithstanding, Keenum's the 3rd string quarterback for Houston behind CJ Stroud and Davis Mills. I would at least call Houston and say, how much for Case Keenum? Because I think that's probably their only chance. because I do agree with you. Like Ryan Tannehill's not healthy, so he's not available. Everywhere else, it's kind of a mess. I mean, Kirk Cousins was the perfect trade candidate for a team if he wasn't already playing for a team that was in playoff contention, because he had a small salary, relatively speaking. He's playing incredibly well for him, for sure. I think it's like Case Keenum. But even then, like the question becomes, I'm going to spin this out your way. Danielle Hunter is leading the NFL in sacks. This is the last year of his deal. There are plenty of teams in the NFL that are true contenders that would give you a second-round pick for Danielle Hunter. That to me, whatever they do at quarterback is kind of like, yeah, it matters. But to me, it's like you have assets on this team that if you're going to start Jaren Hall, it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep playing with Danielle Hunter when you could get a second-round pick for him and he's on an expiring contract and he's going to leave anyway.
When you guys talk about this and this whole trade thing, and it's changed, we talked about it the other day, right? 73% difference from 10 years ago in the trade activity from back when I was in the middle of my career. Like we just weren't doing it in the same way now. You go in and you sit down with your owner, and your owner, it's tough to look your owner in the eye and say, look, we're flailing. We're not really feeling good about this. And the locker room's not going our way. And the coaches are kind of bemoaning, blah, blah, blah. There's locker room or water cooler talk. The last thing you want to do is like build that more and more towards the owner. The owner starts thinking like, my God, do I have the right people in place?
Yeah.
It's a really dicey situation when you start talking, let's start building for next year. It's a little different, I think, than basketball. And at least that's my take, because you want to think we did a lot of other great work here and we can still play some football, get to know these players, play them well so that they're going to be training well for next year. And we don't just throw caution to the wind and say, oh, we're just going to play a whole bunch of other people. And if we lose all the games, it doesn't matter. We're gunning for next year. Most general managers and head coaches are worried about every step of their way. And any black mark they have against them is a black mark against them. And
right. And interestingly, this one situation may give the general manager cover in the sense of you're not for one, and one thing that's really important to understand with respect to the Vikings and the Wilfs specifically is the Wilfs prize playing important games in December and January more than most owners. And Kirk Cousins philosophically is very much that guy. The Vikings have really only been eliminated from the playoffs for like 2 weeks. And they've only made the playoffs 2 out of the 6 years he's been the quarterback, but they've only been eliminated from playoff contention in a game, right? Twice, right? They've only played a meaningless game twice in the whole Kirk Cousins era. The biggest point spread they've ever seen is 7.5. And the biggest point spread they've ever seen at home was the 6.5 that they got San Francisco just 2 weeks ago. So this team is always the Wilfs want you in contention all the time, and they make decisions in that way. And so it was always going to be a long shot to trade Cousins because that was going to put you out of contention. However, if Cousins gets hurt, which is that wasn't your intention, it might finally be the time when they're like, hey, I know we want to compete all the time. It's not my fault we're not competing right now. The quarterback that we brought in is injured. Let's play for next year. It might actually give, because to your point, I don't think football people like that. This is not a baseball season of 162 games or a basketball season of 82 games where it's a slog. This is a once a week and once every 2 weeks at your home stadium event that I know the Wilfs want to make money off of. And if you're starting Jaren Hall, right, the same way that if you were going to start Sean Hill when they went and got Bradford, like that's not a good business proposition for them.
I look back at Arthur Blank. I mean, if Mike Smith and I or Dan Quinn and I would have been saying to them, hey, we're not going to play for every second of every game, every day, every year, whatever, he would have held it against us.
Right.
And it's a really dicey situation when you go in there. If you have an owner that keeps knocking on your door saying, let's work for next year, it's not going to go against you. The reality is you have another year of a losing record potentially, and that does work against you. So anyway, I don't want to beat that point up. It's just not as easy to say I'm going to move on for next year. By the way, what is that green bowling ball? What's that green bowling ball? I'm being a little ADD here. What is that green bowling ball up above your head there? I'm so sorry, but
Oh,
blowing me away. What is
hold
that
on.
thing?
Thank God I'm wearing pants. All right. This is my daughter's Milwaukee Bucks basketball. They're Milwaukee Bucks fans. You notice my shirt says Midwest nice. I'm like
it's all you.
Midwest nice to the core there. But here, I put it on the chair so it's not messing with you so much.
I've never seen it before. And I'm so sorry everyone for bringing that up, but
no, it humanizes us a little bit. Thomas, to ask you a human question though. Yeah. Given everything you've just said and given what you are, because I think about this, you come from the Belichick tree, but I think that you're very distinct from the Belichick tree in a lot of ways. Bill has traded Richard Seymour, Jamie Collins in the middle of the season, Deion Branch in the middle of the season, right? And Randy Moss in the middle of the season. Like he's done this, he's offloaded. Now, never because they weren't going to be competitive. Always because the contracts weren't going to work and they needed to get out ahead of it. And Bill has not traded players in season now that they're not as good, right? Then now that they're not a Super Bowl contender. So I understand the distinction. But if you got another general manager job, let's say, is this something that would come up in discussions, right? With the possible owners and saying like, look, if we have to get off of a season, right? Because it's just not in the cards. How much freedom do I have to do that? Because I get what you're saying. Like, I think about you guys' 2019 season where you start out 1-7, you finish 6-2, and it's you were optimistic going into 2020. That's great and everything, but maybe there is a little bit of value in getting off some players in seasons where you're not competitive. Is that something that you would, how far down the list of things in consideration is that if you were looking, if another general manager job relative to the one you just had, how much does that matter?
I think that's a great question. If I were ever to be interviewing again or advising someone in an interviewing, if Sumer Sports were to be in that mode, right, where we're the coaching consultancy situation, which we obviously are working on, these are really interesting questions. And it's almost synonymous with, the idea of, okay, tell me, Mr. Owner, what you just asked, as well as tell me what is a hit and what is a miss on a certain player. If we drafted a guy who had, who got us to the Super Bowl, 2 years later was a complete jackass and we cut him, is that a hit or miss, right? These are the kind of discussions you do want to have with an owner to make sure the direction and you're not just kind of flailing by the seat of your pants thinking, man, did I hit on this guy just because he got us to a Super Bowl one season? Or does he need to be there for 3, 4, and 5 years or 2 contracts or 3 contracts? Back to your point here. I want to know now going in, can I come in and can I make moves in a season that I think is going in the wrong direction without you holding against me as a general manager and thinking, you're a quitter. The last thing a GM wants to be, or a head coach for sure, is a quitter. And here's the interesting thing. You bring this up about Bill Belichick making moves and moving away from people. When you're riding high, man, and things are good, you just have this sort of cloak of confidence. Like, I don't really give a flip about who leaves, who's water cooler talking at all, because I'm the dude and I own it. When you have a lot of people questioning what's going on, it's a little different to be doing that. All of a sudden, there's this crazy wave within your locker room. That's when it gets really bad.
People think you're scapegoating somebody, right? We even that even came into the little bit of the language with the Leonard Williams thing, where I'm like, is Dable moving on from Leonard Williams because he's a non-fit, or is he moving on from him because he needs a head, right? And he's one of the highest paid. He is, besides Jones, I think the highest paid player on the team. So are you making a statement that way of like, it's my way or the highway? I do agree with you. It's so much different, right? Because we turn it around, right? You look at Sashi Brown, for example, or you look, where they come in and try to put in the process from the NBA and they don't get to see the whole thing through. I think if you're a GM and you're thinking to yourself, like, I want to do the prudent future thing. And even if your owner gives you assurances that you're going to see it out, we've never actually seen ownership give that general manager the time right? John Dorsey's not even the GM. He's 2 GMs ago, right? Like, no one in Cleveland other than Barry, because they've had some team success, No one rides the wave in the NFL of obscurity. We talk about the Lions all the time, and this is one of the reasons why I root for the Lions, is you got Holmes and you got Campbell. They go 3-13-1, then they start 1-6, and everybody's like, oh, trust the process. No. People were talking about cutting off the heads of those two guys this time last year. You watch Sunday Night Football, and I know, my former boss, Chris, and Mike are talking nicely about Ryan Poles, but they're pointing. Who are they sending the camera to?
Yeah.
They're sending the camera to Warren, the former commissioner of the Big Ten, who's now the CEO and president.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that for a minute. I was blown away. I like Kevin Warren. I've known him for many years, and he was very helpful back in the day when I was kind of making my way through, kind of into obscurity for a while there. Goes away, comes back. Now he's on the front and center of Sunday Night Football, and they're holding on him for a minute and a half with the biggest frumpy frown I've ever seen from a senior level executive in this league. I swear to God. Did you see it?
Yeah, and the other weird
he's
thing,
sending messages. He's sending messages.
It's weird. And he was hired, I believe, after Poles and Eberflus.
No question.
All of this stuff, right? And so that's where I get because Ryan Poles, what has Ryan Poles done wrong? He had a Chase Claypool trade that I think most people would have made. Claypool had 10 touchdowns as a rookie, Thomas. You're trying to get an eval on your quarterback, right? They have you strip the roster down to the bone, and even then, Justin Fields is showing some promise. So you bring him a wide receiver, one of the young guys that's available. He sucks. It happens, right? You move off of him very quickly. Exactly what you'd want to do if you were talking about a GM with a clue, right?
Yep.
They're not winning games. And so he's done the whole process. We're not going to editorialize this. They got a very good value for the first overall pick. And they're painting to Kevin Warren on Sunday Night Football. Ryan Poles is sitting there, and I don't know if this is true about the LA Stadium, but above his head is a sign that says RP, meaning this is where you sit, sir. And the whole thing was so crazy to me. I don't.
You know that why that RP is there as well, right? It's for the media when they're panning. They know which guy's Ryan. How about that?
But they should know who he is anyway.
They should, and
he's being overshadowed by Kevin Warren.
I think it's a really interesting and funny comment too. I thought the same. I'm like, maybe they could have a little bit of a 6-inch sign, not a.
Why is it not torn down when he sits down, right? It's you sit it, we come, I always made, and he's our mutual friend, so I make fun of Solomon Wilcots when he first started working at PFF. It was a table. It said Solly W. I'm like, how many other Sollys are there? Why does there need to be Solly W, his name plaque, or it wasn't even a placard? That would be better. It was a sticky note. I'm like, we all know where Solomon sits, right? We all know where Ryan Poles is supposed to sit. But it's crazy to me that, because to your point, we guys like me, we all talk about tanking, but the reality of the situation is no one gets the time to in the NFL unless you hit on a quarterback. And the same thing with you. Your first year, there would have been no other, there's no other better tanking situation than coming off of the quarterback literally having a dogfighting ring in his backyard, going 4-12, having the coach quit 12 games in to do a rah-rah dance at the University of Arkansas.
Crazy.
And you still had they still expected you to win right away.
And Arthur Blank, I look back on this, is probably a lot of owners. 2 years, man, it gets really, really dicey. If you have 2 years in a row where things aren't going well, it's not 4 years anymore. That's why if your owner is giving you this sort of secret, sort of quiet message, you do what you do, but remember, we start getting into a second year of not winning, it's going to get really hot. That's not easy to use up a season, right? You're like, God, I want to make sure I do all I can. If I can, let me bring you back to your comments earlier. Mike Smith and I, that second year after coming off of our big, our important first year, we get back to 9-7, right? And we don't make the playoffs, but it was the first time in forever, right? The history of the team.
Well, I didn't know this either, but the Falcons, by the way, have never won back-to-back division titles. It's the only team in the NFL history, but that was the first time I think of in all time that you guys ever went back-to-back winning seasons.
We were more, so we were, call this right or wrong, you're looking for something that is historical, showing within that organization with the regimes. You did something. So we could have easily said, okay, let's throw away 3 games, not worry about that, and move forward. That was a big thing for Arthur Blank. It was a big thing for Mike Smith and me to make sure we were the first organization and regime to ever win back-to-back seasons, right? That was a big thing for us. Fan base, I don't know if they cared about it a whole bunch. Rich McKay, I don't know. Rich never had back-to-back seasons as a GM at the Falcons. Did it matter to him? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I don't know.
But yeah, and this is something where I think football is like, think about I want to talk briefly about Denver, Kansas City, because Kansas City had a 16-game winning streak against Denver. There were media people and frankly a lot of people who said, like, look, this, it's time to kind of move on from Russ. It's time, all this kind of stuff. It's time to, like, George Payton, is George Payton live? All this kind of stuff. They beat the Chiefs yesterday. First time since 2015.
Yeah.
Awesome. Right. And a bunch of people in Kansas City are like, well, that's cool, because actually, like, Denver's not going to get the first pick. And Denver people are like, look, don't care if you're going to get, like, at some point you've got to beat your division rival for the first time in 10 years or whatever, 8 years. So like there are these things where, and this kind of like we're trying to do at Sumer, where like the utility functions for different teams are different. If you're the Bears right now, like, you already have Carolina's pick, so whatever. But like, and I do think Collinsworth did a really good job of talking about this on the broadcast yesterday, which is the goal of this season should be come out with Justin Fields looking like your franchise guy, because then you could take all those draft picks and pick them. And at some point, if Justin Fields is your guy, the fact that you're picking 6th and not 11th, it does, like, if you're Trevor Lawrence goes on Jacksonville and then they get a good coach in Doug Peterson, and the fact that they completely whiffed on Trayvon Walker in the first pick the next year does not matter that much, right? Yeah. And so I think, like, we look at the tanking deal as way too myopic. Like, I think we look at it and we say, okay, like, until you're actually ready to compete, but you have 17 games where you can collect data on your team. And I think sometimes that data is way more important. Like, I look at what Arizona's doing with Austin Fort and with Gannon, and they're not winning. In fact, they probably pissed a lot of people off last night by covering the spread at the end of the game by being competitive. But, like, they're figuring things out about their team, right? They're competitive enough where you're getting data on your players. I think some teams historically, like, you look at the end of the Joe Judge era with the Giants, and like, where they gave Joe Judge assurances you were coming back for year 3, and the last like 4 or 5 games were so non-competitive that they ended up moving on. To your point again about, like, don't even take these promises that seriously. But, like, there's an element of, you have to put a competitive product on the field to understand what you have in the first place, because there are 53 moving parts, and just to, like, run the clock over 1 year, you're missing an opportunity to evaluate those players as well.
Do you think that Sean Payton is going to stay with Russell Wilson? I'm going to put you on the spot after the season.
I think Russell Wilson is playing well enough to warrant, but I have to look at the cap, because there are some considerations with the cap where cutting him earlier is actually not as bad. The problem is I don't think Sean Payton has the patience to cut Russell Wilson and to be bad for 2 more years, because that's what's going to happen. The cap is going to be so bad. I think Sean Payton rides the wave with Russell Wilson. And I think,
what if someone knocks on the door? I mean, I know there's been discussion about that, right? So I could, that's not easy, right? Someone's knocking on the door and you're wondering about your quarterback situation. You also have a general manager down the hallway, right? In George Payton, who I've told you many times, I think is a really good football man, but he's in a dicey spot with this. Who is going to be the fall guy? Is it going to be Russell? Is it going to be George? Is it going to be both of them one day? Like, or will Sean just say, hey, I can't do anything? If Sean is not, in fact, a fan of Russell, then what? How do you know, did he come in? We don't know it. Did he come in with Greg Penner and the group and say, give me 1 year with him. I'll do all I can. And at the end of this year, all I want to do, I'm going to sign this big time contract with you. I want to hear back to you asking the owner, right? Do I have the wherewithal to make a decision on this? And I will give you a legitimate assessment. And, yeah, he's playing, but I mean, come on. Is he worth $235 million?
No. But is that something where, because the issue is for a contract like that with a signing bonus of 92 million and a base salary next year of 17 million, like, does that matter? Like, because my issue is like, if you're thinking about this from an economist standpoint, that money's already mostly spent. So the question is like whether or not he's worth that is not really relevant because you've paid it already, right? So you can't make the decision to go back and not sign him. I think that the tricky part is right now, like you still have, if you next year were to trade him, let's say you trade him post June 1, that puts 50 million of dead cap on the 2025 cap, as well as I believe 18 million dead cap on next year. And you have to get another team because next year's base salary is 17 million guaranteed. Now, I believe they're rolling guarantees too. So to your point, Thomas, it does get worse, right? It could get worse if he doesn't start playing better. And the way that age curves work, he probably won't. So I think I'm amending my statement. I think it's 50-50. I think it's 50-50 whether he stays with them. And given Peyton is, yeah, I do think they move on from him, actually, now that you've talked me through it.
This is not just, I mean, look, you've heard me say this before. This is not just the ability of the quarterback. This is about his leadership. There is a reason the Seattle Seahawks made the move, right? There's a reason. And it wasn't just, whatever, wherever he is. I mean, if I ask you right now, Mr. Statistician man, Mr. Analytic, genius mathematic guy, where do you think he is? I mean, take away the stats for a second, or take away, in your mind, do you think he's a top 20 quarterback, or do you think he's 25 to 20 to 25?
Without looking, I think he's 18th.
Okay. 18. Solid.
But 18, solid. You can't pay that much money to 18.
Okay. If he's 18, you're paying a ton of money. And again, you've already paid it. And if you're making a judgment on his leadership skills, pure leadership, Coach O'Sullivan, if you want to respond to this, you should, because you know how damn important it is for that quarterback to have legitimate leadership. I'm not saying he wasn't a leader in Seattle, but is he a leader there right now? He came in wanting an office, all the other stuff that went in. Sean Payton comes in, he's trying to work around that. Are you peeing up the proverbial tree on this, right? And I don't know, because I'm a huge believer. You have to have a leader at that position. And so I just don't know, combination is that what they're going to do? Would they go into another year with that? And what happens if they were at loggerheads, the head coach and the quarterback, because the button heads on ego?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, the interesting. So I actually just got a message from I'll promote his work, Parker Gabriel, who's a beat writer for the Denver Post. He's watching the show. We appreciate all the really, really smart people. I got a message from Lindsey Rhodes as well, talking about Kyler Murray. Hopefully we'll get to talk about Murray fairly soon here. But he was saying, so this is very Mahomesian. The 37 million in 2025 becomes fully guaranteed. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it becomes guaranteed relatively soon here. So they're in 2025 becomes in this year, right? So that was the whole point. I knew I read this, but I didn't have the details. Is like it gets worse, right? So next year he's got a 17 million base that's fully guaranteed. If they were to trade it, that trading team takes on that money, but if they were to cut him, that money gets absorbed by Denver. Right. So that's like the whole thing about trades. It's also interesting is signing bonus money. And this is what Jack Easterby was telling us. Signing bonus money, that's already paid. You got to pay the cap. But if you give them guaranteed paragraph 5, that stuff can be traded. So I think I do think they move on. I think the interesting thing about Wilson, though, to your point about leadership, is if I'm going to have, and this is one thing where I misjudge Kirk Cousins a little bit. If I'm going to have a quarterback who's kind of in that 10 to 20 range, I need a guy that the other players like.
Yeah, no question.
Like and Cousins has had a bad rep, but when you want, like, other players like Kirk. And so at least when that happens, there's a little bit of externality to it. The players like Brock Purdy. The players probably like that. I don't know if they like Desmond Ridder, but if I'm going to have a guy like Russ, he can't be nails on the chalkboard to every other player on the team who are all making substantially less than him. And in many cases, those players are better than he is.
It's a great point. Nails on the chalkboard. That's a tough deal to be moving through. Let me ask you another tough question before we move on from Denver. Just because this is really, really fascinating for me, having been in it and understanding how that heated seat deal going on, where George Payton is, and having to look at this deal every day of his life. We had quarterbacks in the past, over the past 5 or 6 years, who have moved on from their number one pick, right? Yep. Took it on the chin and said, screw it, doing it for the team. They've survived, right? How many of them right now? They're still with their teams. Howie's still with his team, of course. He's done a hell of a job with Philly. We know that.
The Jets mostly moved on from Zach Wilson.
Jets, yeah. I mean, okay. Well, of course, we had Chicago, which was a little bit different. But I guess my point is this synonymous? Is a big-time free agent move like this, by moving on, do people take a deep breath? Do the owners know and recognize how good of a football person George Payton is and stay with him? Or do they hold that over his head? We moved on from a guy that you endorsed as much as you did, so we have to make adjustments here. And where does Sean Payton sit with that? Here's my feeling. If Sean Payton is behind George Payton, the general manager, and endorsing him and understanding how good he is, Sean Payton and George Payton stay together, right? Even through the demise, if they ever did move on from Russell. If those two guys aren't aligned, that becomes a really complicated, dicey situation, to use mine.
I personally don't fault George Payton all that much, because the way that I see it, since Peyton Manning, and this is where I'm going to give you my trivia. Since Peyton Manning, it's been Trevor Siemian, Paxton Lynch, Brock Osweiler again, right? By the way, really smart for them to have a limit on Brock Osweiler, right? They didn't let Brock Osweiler take him to the cleaners. And then you were Teddy Bridgewater, Drew Lock, then it was Joe Flacco, Case Keenum all mixed in there. At some point, Russell Wilson was a phenomenal quarterback for the Seahawks. True. And I think what we all misevaluated was how good John Schneider and Pete Carroll were. I think many people, because Pete Carroll's a little old school, he doesn't go for the right fourth downs and all this stuff. We all thought Pete Carroll was much worse at his job than he really was. And it's funny because much like Bill, right, failed with the Jets, failed with the Patriots, comes back and uses those scars to be a championship caliber coach. They're in first place in the NFC West, right? We all thought that Russell was the catalyst, when Pete Carroll deserved a decent, much more credit than he did. And so we all what did you think of Russell Wilson 3 years ago?
Look, I probably knew too many things that were going on within that building with him, that he was starting to weigh heavily on them. He came to Denver, of course, all the stuff we talk about, but okay, you don't, and nor do I blame, George Payton just for that move. He's a GM of the team. Was John still there, Elway, during that deal? And then did he leave after? Did John endorse it as a Hall of Fame quarterback? And the only reason I ask that is because George made the decision, of course, and the ownership had to be behind it, of course, but they were in flux. There was a lot of stuff going on.
I think the issue with Elway is again, all of this is overcorrection, right? And you said this a number of times. I think you're being too humble when you say this, but a lot of success is how well you pick the quarterback, 100%. Yeah. And we over-index on the quarterback so much. Elway's biggest issue was, other than Peyton Manning, he just did he had a lot of bad swings at Paxton Lynch, right? Everybody was, Brock was okay, right? As a second round pick, ended up being, starting in it, but he always preferred the big hulking quarterbacks. And so Russell Wilson didn't fit into that category. And maybe it was a little zig when you previously had been zagging, and a little bit of I always think about you always hire a head coach that's the complete opposite demeanor as the guy that Kevin O'Connell from Mike Zimmer type of thing. And maybe they just overcorrected on some of the mistakes Elway had made at the position and made another one. But again, I don't look back and be oh, I don't engage in the whole oh my God, Denver's so stupid for getting Russell Wilson, because we all thought Russell Wilson was great, right? In the media, let Russ cook was a legitimate Twitter hashtag that everybody wanted Russell Wilson to throw the ball more. And funny, Pete Carroll kind of knew how much to use Russ.
Yeah. Well, look, these are the kind of things that are interesting, though, back to where George is on this. And again, how much was John involved in it? And this isn't throwing darts at anyone. This is more when you're an organization, you're making a decision, right? Everyone needs to know this. It is not just George Paton, the general manager, slamming his fist against the table, telling everyone, I don't give a flip about any of you guys. We're taking this guy. Back in the day, that might have happened. That's not the way it works in the NFL. You're going to be a person, and George is a very collaborative person. But I'm saying both of those because I've been on that side. When you have an owner that whispers in your ear, hey, John Elway is one of the very best to play this and knows the quarterback position more than anyone. Whether he hit on guys or not, he does know that.
Yep.
So an owner is going to say, hey, if this is the case, I don't know if it is, but an owner is going to say, this is a Hall of Fame defensive line coach. Listen to him. Or this is a Hall of Fame quarterback at the position. Listen to him. If he's endorsing this and we have his endorsement, let's go with this, right? It's kind of like it's what a lot of businessmen do, right? They ask around the table, around their board, and they'll take it all in. Even though ultimately the general manager is responsible for acquisitions, in this case, I would assume, he is going to filter out all the really important people with great minds in football, like John Elway and other people, and they're going to make a decision. But a lot of people think, but a GM, that's your job. You're going to take it on the chin if it doesn't work. And that's where we signed up for it as general managers.
Yeah. So I do think ultimately, like if I had to make a prediction, you've kind of spun me in circles here, but I do think Sean Payton moves on from Wilson, and I think that George. I don't know. It's up to me. It's whether it's because I think they've all otherwise drafted okay. I think that the fall person will be George Payton if there is a fall person. I'm not sure that there will be because it's one move, and he did sign Wilson at the going rate, right? Like Deshaun Watson got a bigger deal, more guarantees than he did. So I think that it's interesting. It could go either way, in my opinion, but I do think that Wilson is probably a goner. He has put up good stats on the periphery this year, but he's taken a lot of sacks, and there's been the offense hasn't been quite as good as players with similar stats. So
let me just say this because you're right. I hope that Sean Payton endorses George and they weather this storm, right? Again, given my fondness and understanding of what George is as a football builder and a scout. Everyone in the country knows that, just so the Denver people who are listening. But anyone takes heat when things don't work out. There's other elements, though. When a head coach comes from a different paradigm, right? Yeah. They're always going to have, and I remember when Dan Quinn was coming into our place, there was so much banter out there that I was getting fired because he was going to bring in A, B, and C and X, Y, and Z from the Seahawks family. And there are people that I knew and people that I liked. You don't think they felt uncomfortable about that? They're like, T, I know there's stuff out in the media that I'm coming in to take your job. It didn't happen. Dan and I worked together and we grew together and the rest is history, of course. But, it's just one of those things. It's you'll never know until the end of the season on how everything settles in here in Denver. And I just think it's a fascinating case study. It really is.
Yeah, I think it'll be quite interesting to see how they finish the year. I always thought that they had a chance to make the playoffs in this division, in this conference, because of their defense and because I thought Russ would improve. Russ has improved, but the defense has improved recently, but it's still not particularly good. We'll see. I mean, this division, they could probably win their games against the Chargers and the Raiders. So they've already done both games against the Chiefs and have finished 1-1, so they're okay there. It'll be. I'm intrigued by them for sure.
So Rex Ryan isn't coming there yet. You're not.
No. I mean, look, and it's funny because Vance Joseph is an NFL defensive coordinator, and this idea that he was going to oversee a historically bad defense this is why we do regressions. This is why we do prediction, because what goes up comes down sometimes. And, it's funny, like 1 week, the Niners are the best team in NFL history and they've lost 3 straight. Chiefs are now they lose, right? And then, we cycle through this because the NFL is that way. It's a week-to-week league and the teams aren't that much different than each other talent-wise, week in and week out, which I think from a general manager's perspective must make you feel uneasy, because it's like, no matter what I do, these games are just coin flips at some level, but it's the nature of the league. And so I'm happy for Vance, because I think that he was, more unfairly maligned. I'll just say that, at least initially, when they were giving up 70 points to the Dolphins.
I agree.
Yeah. All right. So let's finish this off. We didn't get to many games, but that's fine. I think people are really happy with the show. Trade deadline tomorrow. Now, I believe this is true because somebody in the league sent this to me. I believe if you were to adjust salary, so we saw the Leonard Williams trade where they took the $10 million left on the deal, they converted it to a bonus. Giants keep that money. They send him over to Seattle. He's basically playing for league minimum in Seattle. I don't know if you can do that from now on, because I believe you have to convert those salaries by the end of the day today. Mm-hmm. We saw through here, and there were some people saying some mean things about Tennessee. Tennessee and Baltimore had agreed to a trade for Henry, but the ownership in Tennessee said, no dice. You're not trading him. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of interesting reports today. I've always said that the draft is a really fun look into the souls of these teams, right? What they value, all this stuff. Tomorrow is a low-key look into the soul for these teams, Thomas. As we finish up, this might be anarchy relative to when you were a general manager.
Anarchy in what way? I'm not.
We might see double-digit trades tomorrow. Who knows?
Yeah. Again, it might be. I'm not getting my head around it. It's complicated for me to feel about moving people unless there are reasons for it. I don't want to circle around in here. So maybe if you want to expound on that. So I'm not.
No, I think that there are a lot of instruments, and I wrote about this at Sumer, so go look, that there are a lot of instruments now where teams don't just have to deal in the ways that they did before. You have void years, you have all kinds of contractual instruments that I think make players more movable. But I think to your point in this entire podcast, which it doesn't come for free. Like if you trade a player or you trade for a player, there are cultural changes that need to be made to incorporate. And sometimes it's as simple as TJ Hawkinson coming in and being the Vikings' second best receiver right away. But other times it's teams thinking like, well, you just traded one of our best players. Are we tanking? I think that's why for a lot of history, there haven't been many trades. And I think even though it's fun, obviously on a Tuesday to be engulfed in the news, I don't think it'll blow up to the level that the NBA or the MLB is.
So I got on a podcast recently with Kevin Clark. I went out and reached out to some of my buddies, of course, contemporaries in the league, who are obviously in general manager spots now. And it was amazing to hear how many people believe, even though there's more movement, Eric, how many general managers believe that the main stirrers of this, and I guess that's us now, right? Are we sort of media? I don't know.
I consider, Thomas, whether you like it or not, you're very good at this. Well, so you're media by skill set.
When I hear from these guys and they start saying to me, Thomas, what's starting all of this is the media being a big deal in saying this needs to happen with this team, this needs to happen. And a lot of these GMs are saying, I'm only jumping in looking at this, and there's discussion about this, even if there's 99.9% that the guy is ever leaving, Derrick Henry or whoever it may be, I'm going to do it. I'm going to have my building looking at these players, and we're going to get caught up in it. People are going to ask us in town that we may be looking for a receiver, or we may be looking for a running back, and I'm doing my due diligence. And I have no desire to do anything, but I have to, because my owner's going to ask me, did you look at him? Is that real? The reason I looked at him is because the media is telling me that he might come out or might be traded. I don't know.
Is that real? Okay, I brought this up, and I know it's awkward. It's also part of our thing at Sumer. So A, if you were ever to get another general manager job, or B, if we were consulting people, which we at Sumer. I am dumbfounded by the idea that that all but maybe a handful of really, really smart people like you, like other people who have shows, who are who have been in that chair, who know what they're talking about. If I was an owner and I found out my GM was getting pressured by the media, I'd be a little nervous. Like, is that too idealistic?
Here's the funny thing. No, I get it. It's kind of like, well, I want this badass GM who's going to tell everyone to go screw themselves if they're questioning the organization. Here, however, is a situation for everyone. When your owner is really dialed into the media and he's got 4, 5, 6, or 7 people within the media in his ear all the time, pushing him, and he's circling around. Hey, what are you doing here? I heard you're doing this. This is owner saying it to GM, and GM's like, where are you getting that information? I have my sources. I can't reveal them. It can get really, really naughty. Naughty, KN, whatever, not NAUGHTY. I'm not, whatever the hell I'm trying to say.
One of my shout out to my former colleague at University of Wisconsin lacrosse, Whitney George, who did not theory. Every one of her social media handles was like naughty, KNOTTY. So I knew exactly what you were talking about, okay. Even if you felt like you were making a flub there. This has been a great podcast. Like, I've had a number of people message me. That's why, by the way, Thomas, I look away for a second, because every once in a while I get messages. I know I'm not. I think sometimes you think that I'm trying to multitask and I'm giving you less. I truly am like trying to navigate like people asking questions and stuff during the show. But this is phenomenal. I think this is, when we think about the trade deadline, we'll have another podcast Wednesday. We'll be able to talk about some of those moves and how they relate to the NFL. But even just like talking about kind of what somebody's going through during this time, I think is incredibly valuable. You're not getting that anywhere else. If you like what you heard on this show, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Go to one of the podcast platforms. May that be Spotify, Apple. Leave a review. Thomas always loves getting those in his inbox. This has been a great time. I really enjoyed spending time talking ball with you, Thomas. For all of you that were there, thanks for all the comments. Thanks for all the likes. For Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show.